Hello and welcome to today's remote session. This is a special broadcast. This is chapter 12 of the Convergence series with the folks over at Abnormal Security. I want to say thank you to them for making this possible. A great partnership with them. We've been doing the Convergence series with them, and it's been fun. Learning a lot, finding cool new presenters and stuff. This is AI and cybersecurity policy. We're going to be navigating regulation and compliance with today's panel. I want to turn things over to Mr. Mick Leach. He's the field CISO over at Abnormal Security. He's going to be the guy kind of guiding us through the conversation today. So Mick Leach, sir, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. Hello and welcome to the latest in our Convergence series. Now, if you're new to the Convergence series, this is our 4th season of the series. And in March, we hosted Chapter 10, Worm, Fraud, Ghost, Oh My, a deep dive into malicious GPTs. And just last month, we hosted Chapter 11, the human element of BEC, what's real, what's hype, and what's next. So be sure to check those out. But today, we're excited to present Chapter 12, AI and Cybersecurity Policy, Navigating Regulation and Compliance. And today I'm joined by a couple of dear friends of mine, James Yeager and Michael Daniel. Michael, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself first, and then I'll go over to James?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're listening to this from. My name is Michael Daniel, and I'm currently the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We're a nonprofit information sharing organization focused on cybersecurity providers. Prior to CTA, I spent over 20 years in the US government, the last 4.5 as President Obama's cybersecurity advisor and a member of the National Security Council staff.
Wow, fantastic. Well, we are very glad to have you. James, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience as well?
Yeah, I'd love to. Although following in Michael's footsteps is a very overwhelming task here. My credentials are far less impressive, but here we are nevertheless. My name is James Yeager, and for Abnormal AI, I currently have the remit to sit over top of our public sector operations, an opportunity that I love. So for us in public sector, maybe an obvious answer for the audience, but that consists of all components of the federal government, civilian, defense, intelligence. I also manage our defense industrial base and federal systems integrator practice. And then I have SLED, state, local, higher education.
Fantastic. James, thank you very much for being here. And I'm Mick Leach, Field CISO here at Abnormal AI. I've been here about 3.5 years. And prior to coming to Abnormal, I was a customer at a Fortune 500 financial services company and had been building and leading security operations, engineering, and architecture capabilities at companies like that for the last 20 years or so. So it's been a minute in cybersecurity, and I'm excited to be able to moderate this conversation today. And so let me kick it off then. Michael, I want to come to you first as our expert here. For those of us who may not have a lot of understanding in what's happening when it comes to AI regulation in government, can you provide us with a brief overview and maybe more specifically how that applies to cybersecurity professionals like myself?
Sure. Although I think if you'd asked me this question 6 months ago, I probably could have given you a more coherent answer that was a little more structured. I think the truth is that governments are really looking at this issue of how organizations are using AI, right? And that applies to its use in the cybersecurity area as well. That said, I think a lot of the regulation, a lot of the regulatory areas are still underdeveloped in this area. And many governments, including the US government, are still trying to figure out exactly how they want to approach this topic. Do they want to lean more towards really encouraging innovation, rapid deployment? Do they want to focus more on safety and security concerns? And I think you're actually seeing frankly, you're actually seeing a wide variety of approaches, even within the United States, particularly at the state level, but definitely seeing it sort of internationally, differences between, say, the US and the EU, but also other jurisdictions, Japan, China, Korea, Australia, around the world. So it's a very complex policy landscape right now without a lot of clear answers.
Yeah, and I want to stay with you for just a moment because you talked a little bit about maybe how the landscape's a little jumbled right now. And so I want to double click into that just a moment and ask, what is how would you characterize the current regulatory environment around AI and cybersecurity? And maybe what phase of evolution or disruption would you consider us in today?
I would consider us in very early days, right? It's not even clear exactly what it is that governments want to regulate. I think, clearly there's an interest in many governments in terms of what decisions AI systems are allowed to make, right? And I think what you see is that's a reflection of most people sort of being they're comfortable with AI making some decisions, like serving you up your next Netflix recommendation, right? Like most people don't have a problem with that. Whether or not you get approved for a loan, for a mortgage, people have a lot more concern about that sort of in general. And I think that's shared across many different cultures, many different countries. And so really what you see is, governments trying to look at those kinds of issues, but they're also looking at issues around like data and, they're looking at issues around intellectual property. So for example, a lot of these generative AI systems were built by scraping large amounts of the web, which took up a lot of creative content from people. And so should the companies that did that, should they compensate the creators for the use of their intellectual property? So all those are the kinds of questions that governments are wrestling with. And I would say there are no clear answers to most of those questions. It's really an issue of, do you want to go slow or do you want to go fast?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And James, let me come to you. What do you see as maybe the most consequential government actions or frameworks in this space today? I think of the executive order on AI or the EU AI Act or NIST's AI risk management framework. There's a lot of things in play today. What in your mind is some of the most consequential actions and frameworks today?
Well, the reality is we don't really know yet. I recognize that's probably a little bit of a non-answer there, Mick. I promise you, I'll give you something to work with here. I guess my point is, look, there's a lot going on in DC at the moment. The situation is very fluid. Michael knows this probably painfully too well, that for better or worse, things don't move at a particularly fast pace in this town. That said, this administration does promise to change some of that, but changing habits can be difficult. If nothing else, it absolutely takes time. And so when you think of policy, when you think of executive orders, binding operational directives, memorandums, et cetera, it's really important that they're actionable, right? There needs to be substance. It can't be guidance. And I'll give you, maybe an example of where I think this was done well. It's not the only example, but if we think back, many, many, many years ago, Tony Scott was the federal CIO, and we were living in the aftermath of the OPM breach. And OMB and ONCD took some action, and they kind of rolled out the 30-day cybersecurity sprint. Now, I'm not going to, go into all the details and the construct of that sprint, but what made that effort incredibly effective was that it was more than just guidance. They were specific and discrete actions that were required of departments and agencies. And the thing about it is they were measurable and they were time bound. We saw similar activity, frankly, come directly after the SolarWinds breach, right? So I guess, in all of that, when you think about this today, we do have some activity coming out of the White House and OMB, and a lot of it, as Michael alluded to, it's in the very early stages. I think we're seeing a new EO dropping, something that's more concrete. I think that's imminent. The good news is the audience has been polled and surveyed, right? There was an RFI that was released several weeks back The government did the right thing. They sought feedback from industry. It's a very sensible thing to do. But I think in the end, we should expect to see a massive premium being placed on AI and AI tooling. I would also expect the government to apply some pressure in the area of more timely adoption of these AI-based capabilities. And hopefully there'll be an emphasis on efforts for the government to kind of, and this is going to sound bad the moment I say it, to kind of get out of its own way. And what I mean by that is, let's find a way to close the gap between the public sector and the private sector, and the type of innovative capabilities that we need to kind of possess and harness are out there. And we need to kind of grab a hold of those in order to get some leverage back on the adversary community.
Yeah, great points all around. I love the idea that we're looking to build a framework that fosters innovation, doesn't impede it, and yet builds a structure, a framework that allows us to do so in a safe way. Michael, coming back to you here, how do you expect the role of some of those regulatory bodies like CISA and NIST or the FTC to evolve as AI continues to play a larger role in cyber defense?
Yeah, so I think when you look at, well, first of all, just in the interest of my friends at CISA, they will insist that they are not a regulatory agency for most things. So I will give that disclaimer out there. DHS has some regulatory functions in certain areas, but not CISA. So, but I do think that CISA will be looking at issues about how agencies actually use those AI tools that James was talking about, and do they employ the right safeguards around them to make sure that, for example, data is not leaking, just as one, example. But I think that all of those agencies, so just like you've had to see financial regulators develop expertise in new financial mechanisms, and our financial regulators currently are having to develop expertise in cryptocurrency, just as an example. Regulators like FTC and others will have to develop some facility for understanding how AI works, not at a deep technical level, but at a functional level for how companies employ it. What are the risks? What are the benefits? What are the standards of care, that you should expect? What's reasonable for a company to do in terms of what are reasonable safeguards that it should put in place? And we're going to have to build that expertise in those regulatory bodies. We've had to do this across the board in the federal government for cybersecurity almost from the beginning. Whether you're talking about now, for example, if you're in the National Highway Transportation Security Administration or Safety Administration, you've got to have some facility with what cybersecurity looks like in connected automobiles, because that's just a fundamental part of building an automobile these days and running, having a car and doing it. So they've got to have some degree of expertise there. And so what I think you should expect is that over the next few years, you will see our regulatory agencies trying to build that expertise in AI and come to understand how those AI systems can work, should work, what are the best practices for employing them, both inside the government and in, society more broadly.
No, that's perfect. And it makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. And no offense to our friends over at CISA. I know you're not a regulatory or governing body, but do love the great work that you're doing as a cybersecurity practitioner. Consume the work that you're doing every day. So thank you for that. All right, we'd like to transition now over to applying AI in cybersecurity, both the challenges and the opportunities that we have. James, I want to come to you here and ask, what do you see as the biggest compliance challenges when using AI in cybersecurity? And let me go on to say, just, make this a little more clear. And is explainability or transparency still a major roadblock in this?
Well, to start, I'll point back, just quickly to, some of my earlier comments, right, is that, we do need to find a way to overcome this apprehensive posture when it comes to AI. I mean, look, I get it. It's still a bit mysterious, when it comes to how people think about AI. AI brings both a tremendous amount of promise to the table, but dragging along with it is a fair amount of peril, fair or unfair. And that's kind of the conflict. And we're smack dab in the middle of it. Your mileage can vary quite substantially when you consider where people stand on AI. 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, this was a totally different conversation. Everyone, was still somewhat in disbelief, and was constantly trying to demystify AI. But I'll say this: those of us in industry, we haven't helped matters. We've exacerbated this to a degree because we take AI and we create a little bit of stigma. I mean, every company out there today is seemingly an AI company, right? I mean, it's actually laughable. If nothing else, it's incredibly confusing. If we think back at RSA from a couple weeks back, all you heard was AI. Last year, 2 years ago, was zero trust. So, just imagine how difficult that makes it for the government to make heads or tails out of what everyone is saying. But the truth is, Mick, that we've got some proof now, right? There is evidence. There's true results when it comes to the outcomes that AI can help produce. So we do need to kind of make this concession that not only has AI arrived, but it's here to stay. In spite of all the uncertainty, it's really not so much, kind of getting to your question, it's not so much like what it does, but it's really like, how is it doing it? So when you think about explainability and transparency, I think this is a really good place to start, and something that we can do, frankly, as an industry, to demonstrate what our AI models are doing. What are we producing? How are we producing it? How have we arrived at certain conclusions? If we can get there, we'll all be better off in the long run. The mystery of the black box, if you will, fuels some of this hesitation here. And this is, maybe a little bit of a shameless plug here, but if you think about our platform, Mick, one of the really cool and distinct features that we bring to the table and makes the customer experience very intuitive is that, we don't want our customers necessarily just to take our word for it, right? We want to be educators as well. So when we render a verdict about specific threat-related activity, we do our best to inform the customers about the signaling that's allowed us to arrive at that conclusion. It kind of, breaking it down into the most simplistic and logical way possible. And that transparency, that's how you build trust. That's how you build confidence. And I think in the end, that's going to be a critical factor if we think about how we're going to accelerate the adoption curve.
Yeah, and that's near and dear to my heart as well. As a security professional, having that kind of transparency. Many solutions that we buy today are like a black box. There's feeds that go in. There's some sort of magic sauce, and then out comes an outcome, a decision. And we're told as security professionals, just trust us. Our solution knows what it's doing. But that's challenging for me because, listen, I'm a security professional. We all have trust challenges, right? Trust issues. That's what makes us good at our jobs. And so I love that we're starting to see a pushback on the vendor community to say, listen, we want more explainability. We want more transparency in the solutions that are being brought to the table today, because I think the market deserves that, and we need to better understand that. You talked about a number of things: data elements, what data elements are being consumed, how are those being consumed, how are they being leveraged, and where's all that data being stored? Those are the kinds of things that I'm hearing from my partners in cybersecurity. Those are the things that they want us to be able to answer. So agree wholeheartedly with you. Michael, I do want to come back to you because you're close to this in terms of the policy and the government. Have you seen any industry standards emerge for responsible AI in security tools, or is it still very much to be determined?
Yeah, I think it's more in the to be determined category. Of course, I will point out that to many degrees, we've been using AI in cybersecurity for a decade now, right? If you think about what people really mean is they're talking about generative AI, right? Like classification AI systems have been around for a long time and have been used quite well in, sort of in cybersecurity companies, for example, to determine whether or not a piece of software is actually malicious or not, right? And distinguishing between those two. So pattern recognition, classifiers, things like that have been used for a long time. What we're talking about now is really this advent of the generative AI, and then the next step, which is that agentic AI, right? AI that will actually take action on behalf of security operations. And I think those are some very exciting areas. What I think you're starting to see is the ones that are being successful at integrating these tools are the ones that follow those principles that James was talking about, right? And that you were just talking about, Mick, of like being clear with their customers, like, yes, to some degree, the AI is a black box because no one is really able to completely explain it. But here's what we put in, and here's what we expect the system to do, right, for you. And this is how we use it. This is how we use the data. This is where it's stored. All of those kinds of things give customers much more comfort with how those AI tools are being employed. And I think the industry as a whole still suffers from a problem of it's hard to measure cybersecurity, right? And so it's very difficult for any cybersecurity company to make the claim, yes, clearly my stuff is better than everybody else's and I can demonstrate that for you by this, right? And that is a problem that the industry still struggles with sort of globally. And I think that the need to deal with these AI tools and other things is going to accelerate the adoption of those kinds of metrics that will actually help us, really as consumers of cybersecurity tools, it will actually be very beneficial in the long run. But we're still at those very early days about how to use these tools. And frankly, I don't think anybody should be very surprised by that while the technology can change, like people can only adopt the technology so fast, organizations can only adopt it so fast. And so, in the grand scheme of things, these generative AI tools in particular are still pretty new. And we're still figuring out like how to move beyond the hype of what, the initial sort of claims about what they could do and look at like, okay, how is this actually useful? How does this tool make my life better, right, as a cybersecurity practitioner?
Yeah, great point, Michael. And something else that I thought as you were explaining that jumped out to me is the adoption rate. While we have, to your point, seen innovation moves much faster than we are comfortable embracing it, what we have seen is the adoption rate of AI is off the charts. The number of folks, it took, days to get to 1 million users of ChatGPT and to 100 million users of ChatGPT, far faster than technology has ever been embraced and adopted by the population before. So, we are seeing this kind of unusual convergence of both the speed of innovation, but also the speed of adoption is quickly paralleling it. So that's very interesting. Now, I'd like to come to both of you with this question, but I'll start, James, with you. How should companies balance this innovation with governance when our security vendors are increasingly embedding AI into their products?
Yeah, well, so it's tricky, right? I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. Striking that balance is, if there was an easy answer, to how to solve for that, I think we'd be in a much better position. But if you think about, maybe like the regulatory pressure and, kind of, the compliance obligations, right? Look, if I'm being really, really honest, I think that sometimes there's too much compliance, going on. I think if you're paying attention, you've likely already observed that, a shift away of additional oversight and regulatory behavior is likely underway, coming from this new administration. Compliance is always going to play a role. It's always going to be a factor, whether you love it or hate it. There's something very practical about, compliance measures, checks and balances. And of course, I'm dramatically oversimplifying compliance when I say that, but, they are necessary. And as much as we talk about, leaning into new technology and AI powered capabilities, we do need to avoid certain impulses. We can't be reckless about it. I mean, Michael just, hinted at that. We have, government organizations that are dealing with incredibly sensitive data. When you think about the Defense Department, we have lives at stake. And I'm not saying that for effect or, to be dramatic, but, the mission is what we should always be focused on. So, we don't want to see a 180, degree pivot, here necessarily, but rather we should be striving for that balance that you talked about, faster adoption of new tech. Yes. Accelerating timelines for testing and pilots. Yes. A much more streamlined approach, fueled by automated processes when it comes to matters like ATOs. Absolutely. Yes. But, so it's kind of like we can't have the tail wagging the dog, for forever here. But, meaningful outcomes have been superseded historically by compliance at times, right? And it creates a massive barrier for that innovation. But on the other hand, going back to threading that needle very carefully, we do need to understand that compliance are healthy and they're a very productive part of the equation. So we're always going to have it. It's always going to play a role going forward. But I do think the future will prove that it will no longer be maybe the inhibiting factor for some of the progress that we're looking for that it has been historically.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Michael, same question back to you. Again, how should companies balance innovation with governance when security vendors are increasingly embedding AI into the products that they offer us?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the questions that you really want to be looking at is, sort of what problem is that tool trying to solve? To pick up on something that James said, like, you don't want the tail to wag the dog. Like, AI is cool and all, but we're not adopting AI just because it's the latest, RSA buzzword, right? That was all over the place. You're adopting it because it actually does something for you, right? The tool helps the cybersecurity vendor in some way, and it helps you as a consumer in some way. And so you should be thinking about asking your vendor, your cybersecurity vendor, okay, how does this tool help? What is it, does it make things more efficient? Does it make things more effective? How do you know? Asking those kinds of questions. I mean, we ourselves at CTA have looked at how we adopt, AI tools into, what we do as a threat sharing organization. And we've been very clear that it needs to actually serve a business case for us. That it's not just about adopting the latest cool technology. It's about actually employing that technology in a sensible way. And I think that, to me, that's the right way to approach it, is asking those questions about the business case, the use case for it, and really being clear-eyed about what it is that it's doing for you. And it's okay to say, we think it might do this. Let's run an experiment. Right? Let's try it and see. That's absolutely fine. So you don't have to have the answer to that all of the time, but you should know what you're trying to achieve with that tool. And I think that's that's how you make that balance between the rush to sort of adoption to, and then at the same time, you need to be actually rigorously looking at this as a company and saying, okay, what of my processes, what are the things that we're doing, could AI actually help with? At a certain point, and I've seen this over and over again, with adopting technology, particularly when I was in the government, was that eventually somebody had to say, okay, yes, I understand that there is some risk. We're going to take it, because the benefits could easily outweigh this. And sure, the risk averse thing is to do nothing, but then we're still, writing out memos on typewriters, right? And that's just not, the right way to go. So you do have to, eventually be willing to take some of that risk. But the issue is connecting that risk taking to, the outcome, the business case that you want to achieve.
Yeah, and so Michael, there's two threads I wanted to pull on a little bit there. First, thank you for bringing up use cases. The companies that I have personally seen be incredibly successful with their adoption and use of AI, it's because they started with some very clear-cut use cases in terms of what deliverables they wanted, and then were able to overlay the technology to help them be successful. So I like that. The other thing, you had mentioned this concept of risk averse and having to make the leap and jump in. I have historically seen, basically from my time in the military, the public sector tends to be a little bit more risk averse than a lot of the private sector. Is that something you've seen, and how do you expect them to kind of get over the hump and really start to dive in with some of these new technologies?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely the public sector is more risk averse than the private sector in general. And I would actually argue that we kind of want it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a lot of the data that the government deals with is incredibly sensitive about citizens. The government can take action, like law enforcement action. They provide benefits, and there's questions about that. There's the military, other things. So I think in general, you want the government, you want public sector agencies to be more risk averse than the private sector. What you don't want them is to be so risk averse that they never adopt, or a decade and a half behind the private sector, right? So being beta or even gamma adopters of a new technology is fine, but you just don't want it to go too slow. And so I think what you really want to see in the public sector is them learning from what has happened in the private sector, right? And letting the private sector work out some of the kinks, some of the best practices, and then the public sector should adopt it. But what my experience has also shown is that you need leaders in the public sector who are actually saying, okay, we've reached the point where we need to make that leap. And so you got to have people who are in fact driving it from the inside to say, all right, we've got enough, experience now in the private sector that we can drive forward. We could drive forward over here. And I think that's the appropriate balance.
Yeah, and I love the way you put that. That was an excellent explanation over that balance. Thank you very much. Now I want to kind of start looking ahead here. And James, first I want to come to you. What do you anticipate in the next 12 to 18 months in terms of regulatory pressure or compliance obligations for AI-powered cybersecurity tools?
Yeah, well, we've touched on the edges of this a little bit already. And both Michael and I have kind of shared that, it's an impossible kind of position to predict, what's gonna, come out with the volatility and tremendous amount of change that's kind of going on here with this new administration. I think that there's going to be. I think that there's going to be some regulation, as I mentioned earlier, right? This administration, I think, is going to shift away from, a ton of government oversight and maybe imposing their will, whether anyone agrees with that or not. There's a pretty distinct shift between the way this administration thinks about regulatory matters when it comes to previous administrations. I make that statement in a completely nonpartisan way, by the way, my safe harbor statement. But there's going to be some regulation, for sure, right? I think Michael kind of hit on it, right? Like, we can't be careless, right? Some of the laggard approach that we have witnessed for decades in the government is very intentional, right? It's by design. And it's been pragmatic, right? And so, regulation and compliance efforts kind of help govern that a little bit and kind of help, like, as a guiding principle. When I think about, something more specific, like, FedRAMP, for example, something very near and dear to our heart, Mick, right? Or advanced compliance thresholds, through DISA for DoD, like impact levels. Controls that are even more stringent when you talk about supporting the intelligence community. That has, for a very, very long time, that type of kind of compliance framework has been clunky and a little archaic. It's been dependent greatly on manual, efforts and intervention. So I think what you'll see is technology and AI kind of embedded into those frameworks to streamline the process, to create some efficiencies. And that's ultimately a good thing. But I think, again, to the point Michael made, we can't have a 180 there and then just, let the machines completely take over, right? Humans are always going to be in the loop. And so, finding that balance there between, what type of costs can we avoid? What type of operational efficiencies can we gain? That's fantastic, but we need to have some oversight there and some compliance and regulation to make sure that, it's not such a far departure from where we were before, because there's just far too much at stake when you talk about the sensitivity of government information and government missions, the impact if this goes the wrong way, and if we act too impulsively, constituents and citizens, stand to be impacted in an incredibly negative way. So I think we'll see plenty, but I think it's also a little bit, too early to kind of see what some of these measures are going to look like. I mean, there's a lot of anticipation and speculation, but just understand that, like, the government, I think, is taking this very seriously, and they've got some of the, our best people looking at it. So I'm very encouraged.
No, that makes sense. And Michael, I want to come back to you. James mentioned we have some of our best people looking at this, and I would agree. In your opinion, Michael, should companies be more proactive and engaging with those policymakers now, or should they wait for more concrete regulation to emerge before doing so?
Oh, I always think it's better to engage frequently, and as the technology is developing, right? A lot of the people on the government side are eager to actually learn about how these tools are being incorporated into business processes in a concrete manner. It is much better as a policy official when you're trying to figure out, priorities and directions and things. If you have concrete examples that you can build on, that makes it much easier to have those conversations inside the government, because then you're not talking about abstractions. You're actually starting to talk about specific use cases. Okay, well, what about this? How do we think about that? What do we think about that? That's a much more solid place to be than dealing purely with abstractions. I would also say that I think the challenge for a lot of cybersecurity companies will be a really diverse, we'll come back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's going to be a very diverse regulatory landscape. And what you're doing here in the United States and what you're facing in the United States will be very different than if you're trying to sell products in Germany or Italy. And very different, again, if you're trying to sell products in, Israel or Jordan or, Thailand or Vietnam. Like, there's going to be a very, very diverse regulatory environment. And so I think that will be a challenge for anybody that wants to work in the international space. And so I think, to loop it back to this, I think one of the things that the private sector should do is really push for as much harmonization in those approaches as possible. Like, we understand that there's going to be deviations for cultural norms in different countries. Got that. But can we have as much consistency as possible so that the deviation is only 10% of the compliance burden as opposed to 80% of the compliance burden, right? And I think those are the kinds of conversations that it's valuable to have early, right? Because once those regulations and things are set, they're much harder to change. But if if you're engaging with policy officials in different countries and you're like, hey, actually this framework from over here, we kind of like that framework. If you're going in ahead of time, then those officials are much more likely to say, well, we'll go look at that and see and maybe adopt that, because they don't have a vested interest in what it is that they've already set up. And so now is actually the time to have those conversations to drive that harmonization, or at least try to drive it.
Yeah, and I'm just going to +1 the harmonization point. as a security professional who has to adhere to all of these various compliance regulations. So yes, lawmakers and private sector, get out there, reach out, push for that, because you're absolutely right. I think that makes life a lot easier for all of us, really. I think about GDPR and how that really set a standard in terms of privacy and personal information, and how we care for that, and how many other organizations, many other countries got on the same page with that. What a great idea that was. And I hope we choose to do the same thing in terms of AI regulation. So good point there. Final question for both of you at this point. And I'm going to start with James here, and then I'll come back to you, Michael. But what is one misconception that security leaders have about AI and regulation that you wish you could clear up for us?
One misconception. So you're thinking about this in terms of like, the end user, the consumer, right? Yeah, I mean, I think, giving you one is awfully difficult, Mick. Darn you. I'm gonna cheat. I'll give you two. And they're kind of like opposing facts. So, I think on one hand, and it just has to do with like this kind of competing, narrative, which I think is what creates some of the theatrics around AI. Like on one hand, I think, people who are all in on AI, get super excited and they think of it as kind of this catch-all, right? It can solve all my problems. We can work at machine speed. You think about the processes, that Michael was alluding to, like, how do we define the way that we conduct business today, or day-to-day operations? And you think about, the allure and the bright lights of AI, and you think about, well, man, this is so archaic the way we do it today. It requires so many man hours. It's so antiquated. AI can really solve it, right? That's not necessarily true. Are there dramatic improvements in some cases? Absolutely. I think the other side of that is that, I think there's great, fear when it comes to AI, right? And so I think about that stigma that I described, which, unfortunately, as an industry, we contribute to, because, now Walmart's an AI company, I learned the other day. So, which is kind of interesting and funny at the same time, but credit to Walmart for buying in. You can't be intimidated by it, right? I think, the apprehension that we have, is something that, like, we've got to really overcome. And I think on one hand, you've got the people who are really bought in and they're ready to go. On the other side, you have this cynicism and skepticism that I think is going to be, somewhat problematic, right? Because people are institutionalized. We're creatures of habit, and so, that mystique is a little bit unfortunate. I think the other thing that is kind of on the tail of that is that, people are awfully concerned that their livelihoods are going to be threatened by the introduction of AI, right? If you think about all the virtues of automation and all the processes and that we're automating, all the efficiencies that can be gained, I think there's a natural fear that we have to be compassionate and sensitive to, that people are thinking, well, I'm not going to adopt this technology because it's going to maybe threaten my job. I guess in some cases, maybe that could be true, but the alternative way to think about that, and this is maybe the glass half full way to consider it, but I do think there's a lot of reality to it, is there's far too many jobs for people to do and not enough people to do the jobs. So when you think about cyber and you think about the high value tasks that people are failing to get to on a day-to-day basis, we can optimize SOC teams and InfoSec professionals. We can also maybe enrich their lives a little bit by giving them more exciting things to work on. And so those are just some of the things that I think we have to work through. And as an industry, we've got to be incredibly empathetic when we start to talk about, these technologies in that way, and really, kind of put yourself in the shoes of the end user and the operator, and think about how we can change their lives for the positive. And how we articulate that message is something we've got to be really careful with.
Yeah, I agree. And Michael, let me come back to you now. What's a misconception that's you would love to clear up that security leaders may have around AI and regulation?
Well, I think that one of the issues that I see in this space is that that it's impossible, that the technology is going to move so fast that it is impossible to have any sort of regulation on this technology, and we need to just let it go and have 1,000 flowers bloom and all sorts of ideas, come out. And I think, the reality is that any technology that can impose harms on society will eventually have some form of government oversight and regulation, even in the United States, even if it's fairly light touch, even if it's fairly limited. Like, it's just impossible to think of a technology with as many ramifications as AI that will have no oversight or government control at all. Like, that's just a fantasy. And I think that, so it's a misconception in my view that the government is completely incapable of ever saying anything useful about AI. So at the same time, it is entirely possible for governments to be really stupid about how they go about imposing regulation and compliance burdens, as we've discussed. And so the challenge for industry, I think, in the cybersecurity industry, the AI industry, is to have productive conversations, acknowledging that there's going to be some government role, but let's talk about how to do that right in a way that actually achieves the goals that the government wants, which is safety and security, public health and safety, right, economic security, national security, with the goals for industry, which is profitability, innovation, those kinds of things, and what the consumer wants, which is improved standard of living, improved capabilities, those sorts of things. And so I think that my statement in here is that there's a lot more space for those conversations than a lot of people realize.
Now that makes a lot of sense. I love the way you put that. I think it does exist at polar opposites, where you have folks that expect regulation to come in and protect them, remove all risk, and make the use of AI completely safe. And then I think there are other folks that think there's nothing that can be done. There's no governance, there's no compliance that can be brought to bear to make it safe at all. And so there's no need to even bother. And so I think there is that healthy tension between the two. It's a lot like motorcycle protecting a motorcycle rider. You can regulate a helmet and maybe a vest that makes things a little safer, but you'll never remove all of the risks. So I agree with both of your points completely. So as we kind of come to a close here, Michael, if our audience can only take away one thing from today's wide-ranging and incredibly informative discussion, what would you have that be for them?
Well, I would say that AI systems are a tool, right? They are still, those generative AI systems, they may really sound like, they may do a pretty impressive facsimile of being human, but they are still software, they are still tools. And we should not lose sight of that. And that we can really have productive, engaging policy discussions about how we want to manage the use of those tools. And that it requires thoughtfulness, it requires some openness, but we can have those conversations. And I don't think just throwing up our hands and saying the problem is too hard is the right way to go.
Couldn't agree more. James, same question for you. If someone can only take away one thing from this great discussion, what would you have that be?
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed the discussion, by the way, Mick, and thanks again, Michael. We've covered a lot of ground. I think we've established firmly that there's a lot of unknowns out there. Maybe one thing to say as we wrap up, I think about the adoption of emerging technology. And Michael made a fabulous point earlier, right? Which is like, look, AI has been embedded in many, ways, shapes, and forms for some time now. And it's really more these harvesting of newer AI capabilities. I'm looking forward, if you think about policy and what's ahead, I'm looking forward to the government finding new ways to kind of break free from some of the shackles. It's awfully challenging for the government to find ways to demonstrate and test the efficacy of emerging technology, right? look, it's kind of an awfully convenient thing for me to say, but I'd love for that to happen, but seriously, in the world of IT and more specifically cyber, and this is going to be one of those master of the obvious statements, right? The adversary continues to win far more than they lose, unfortunately. They just possess, so many advantageous kind of qualities and characteristics over the defensive side. And, the most glaring, place to point to here is on the personnel, on the resourcing. But the other leverage point that they have is kind of in their weaponry, right? Their weapons of choice when it comes to tools and tech is basically like whatever the heck they want it to be, right? You think for 1 second that they're going through an ATO process before they determine if they're going to want to, utilize AI in their attack campaigns. So, their operational kind of tempo and capacity is demonstrated with great speed and agility. They're constantly harnessing the full power of AI, speed, automation, precision. And, if we can't meet fire with fire, when it comes to confronting this challenge, like it gets far worse before it shows any signs of getting better. So what's at stake here in the end, if we tend to overthink this, if we make it more complicated than it necessarily needs to be, I think it's going to continue to be, a challenge. So the question becomes, can technology play some role, in like this salvation effort, right? And kind of reclaiming some of that leverage back and getting some of the capacity back to the defensive side. Many years ago, I think, the answer was probably no. Technology really hadn't arrived. I don't think we can make that statement any longer, and we can't use it as an excuse. So I'm looking forward to the government and some of the government officials finding ways to empower the government to be able to kind of field test some of this technology, to get to Michael's point, like, does it really do what it's advertised to do? Like, let's go see it in action.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you. I think that going forward, we're going to need to harness the power of AI for good to battle the use of AI for bad, which we're seeing bad actors doing today. So gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate your time with us today. Just as a quick note about here at Abnormal, we also believe that AI is the future of cybersecurity. The Abnormal Behavior Platform uses a superhuman understanding of human behavior to protect against phishing, social engineering, and account takeovers. And don't take my word for it. Try Abnormal for yourself. We offer a free risk assessment and gap analysis. The platform integrates with your Google or Microsoft 365 environment in 30 seconds and immediately begins learning. In a week or so, you'll receive a report that shows all of the current threats that are currently slipping through your tech stack and gives you the opportunity to address those. As a defender myself, I know that you can't defend that which you can't see. So I would encourage you to take a look at this free risk assessment and see what's slipping through your current tech stack today. So with that, gentlemen, I want to say thank you very much, Michael and James. I appreciate you both joining and having this amazing discussion today.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot, Mick. Great job. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all in the audience. Thank you, the folks over at Abnormal. Thank you, James and Michael, for being part of our panel today. This concludes Chapter 12 of the Convergence series with folks over at Abnormal. If for some reason you missed any of those, we've got Chapter 10 and 11. I've got links in the resource tab, along with some other cool stuff we've got from the folks over at Abnormal that you're probably going to want to check out. But the links for those, if you missed Chapters 10 or 11, are available in there. Of course, it's on demand. You can watch these at any point in time, and they are available for at least the next 90 to 120 days. So maybe after summer, they might be gone. But check them out as soon as you can. Lots of great stuff in there. Cool presenters on those, too. That being said, if you haven't already, grab your certificate of attendance down there in the menu bar, along with those resources. But grab all that stuff. And we'll see everybody at the next remote session, or hopefully the Convergence series when we bring that one back with the folks at Abnormal. So be well, everybody. Thank you again for attending, and we'll see everybody at the next remote session. Be well.